They'd been talking about it for years, an elusive, friends-only vacation. But between work, relationships, and life's countless curveballs, it never seemed to happen. Finally, though, everything lined up for Jake, Maria, Evan, and Lisa. They blocked off their schedules and pooled their savings for a trip that promised relaxation, adventure, and a temporary escape from the daily grind. Their destination was a small coastal town on the edge of the map, virtually unknown, with only the barest mention in travel blogs. They'd chosen it for its remoteness, hoping to escape the usual tourist crowds and explore untouched beaches, trails, and coves. Evan, always the trip planner, found a single rental cabin near the water, and Maria sourced their route through forested roads, adding a layer of excitement to the adventure. The trip felt spontaneous and freeing. They were all in high spirits, unaware of the trials waiting in the shadows of the seemingly serene landscape. The drive was long, winding, and exhausting. As they passed through dense forests and endless coastal views, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting an orange glow across the sea. By the time they arrived, night had settled, and a warm ocean breeze welcomed them. The cabin was just as they'd imagined it, rustic and isolated, standing alone against the vast dark sea. They unpacked, sharing laughter and stories by a small fire pit before settling into the quiet, peaceful night. The next morning, they were greeted by the first light of dawn peeking through their cabin windows. Maria, the early bird, was up first, pulling open the curtains to reveal a breathtaking view of the ocean. Sparkling blue water stretched out for miles, meeting a pale blue sky dotted with fluffy white clouds. The others joined her, and for a while they simply stared, mesmerized by the beauty. Breakfast was a simple spread, enjoyed on the small deck as they watched seabirds soar above. Evan, ever the thrill-seeker, was the first to suggest they explore the open water. "We came all this way. We've got to take advantage of the ocean. Let's rent a boat, go snorkeling, maybe even try to catch some fish." Lisa and Jake exchanged glances. They loved the idea of venturing out, but something about the ocean's vastness gave them pause. Jake, the most cautious of the group, was especially hesitant, but Maria and Evan's excitement quickly wore him down. Soon, they all agreed to rent a boat for a day out on the water. At the marina, they rented a small motorboat, enough for the four of them, and stocked it with essentials: water, snacks, sunscreen, and life vests. The locals warned them about strong currents and unpredictable weather, but assured them that if they stayed close to shore, they'd be fine. They set out under the bright mid-morning sun, the wind in their faces as they zipped across the calm water. For the first hour, everything was bliss. The sun was warm, the sea was calm, and they were the only boat in sight. It felt like they had the entire ocean to themselves. They laughed and joked, taking turns steering and pointing out fish swimming below. Jake, despite his earlier reservations, was the first to jump into the water, with Maria quickly following. They swam, floated, and let the gentle waves carry them. It was the kind of carefree moment they'd all been craving. After swimming, they climbed back on board and drifted, relaxing under the sun with cold drinks in hand. But then, without warning, the weather began to change. The sky grew darker, and the wind picked up, turning from a gentle breeze into a chilling gust. Evan noticed it first, feeling the boat begin to sway more aggressively. He turned to the others, a nervous grin on his face. "Looks like we might get a little rain. Maybe we should head back?" Lisa nodded, her eyes on the now choppy water. Jake, sitting at the wheel, started the engine, but the wind and waves made it difficult to steer. The sea, once calm and inviting, now seemed to stretch out endlessly, an ominous shade of gray. "It's fine, we'll just take it slow," Jake reassured them, though his voice betrayed a hint of worry. They were far from the shore, farther than any of them had realized, and the coastline was only a faint line on the horizon. As the storm intensified, rain began to pour, heavy and unrelenting, blurring their vision and soaking them to the bone. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the angry waves that now towered around their small boat. They clung to whatever they could, trying to keep their balance, as the boat rocked violently. Maria screamed as a massive wave crashed over them, nearly tipping the boat. Panic set in, and they began to shout over the roar of the storm, their voices barely audible. "Jake, can't you steer us out of this?" Evan yelled, gripping the side of the boat, as another wave threatened to capsize them. "I'm trying," Jake shouted back, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel, but the engine sputtered and stalled, leaving them at the mercy of the raging sea. They were now drifting, tossed about like a toy in a bathtub, with no control and no way to navigate. Then the unthinkable happened. A monstrous wave loomed over them, crashing down with a force that split the boat in two. They were thrown into the water, each of them gasping as the icy cold stole their breath. Disoriented and terrified, they struggled to stay afloat, clinging to pieces of debris as the current pulled them further apart. Maria and Jake managed to find each other, clinging to a piece of the wreckage. Evan was nearby, his face pale with fear, while Lisa was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through them as they called out her name, their voices swallowed by the relentless wind and waves. Finally, a faint cry answered them, and they spotted her a few yards away, struggling to keep her head above water. The hours that followed felt like a nightmare. They were miles from shore, with only fragments of the boat keeping them afloat. Exhausted, freezing, and terrified, they clung to each other, forming a tight circle for warmth and support. Night fell, casting a heavy darkness over them, broken only by flashes of lightning. Their muscles ached, their fingers numb from gripping the slippery wood. Lisa was shivering uncontrollably, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. As dawn broke, they were barely conscious, their strength almost entirely gone. But then a miracle, a faint hum reached their ears. They strained to see through half-closed eyes, and there, cutting through the morning mist, was a small fishing boat. They waved weakly, their voices hoarse as the boat drew closer. The fishermen spotted them and hauled them on board, wrapping them in blankets and offering sips of warm tea. The friends were silent during the ride back, each of them lost in their thoughts, their bodies aching but grateful to be alive. When they finally reached shore, they huddled together, unable to speak. The beach that once seemed like a paradise now felt ominous, each crashing wave a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. They packed up their things in silence, the cabin and the coast holding no charm for them anymore. That trip left a mark on each of them, a sobering reminder that nature, though beautiful, could be terrifyingly indifferent to human life. And as they drove away from that quiet coastal town, they left behind a piece of themselves, a part that had faced the ocean's rage and emerged forever changed. When Ben and Sarah stumbled upon the online listing for a cozy, isolated house by the lake, they couldn't believe the price. "There's got to be a catch," Sarah murmured, scrolling through the pictures. The place looked charming, with its rustic stone walls, ivy-covered facade, and a serene view of the misty lake stretching out like glass under the moonlight. The reviews, however, hinted at something peculiar. Several renters claimed the house was creepy, with odd noises and a strange, suffocating feeling. But Ben shrugged it off, laughing. "They're probably just city folk getting spooked by old house noises. For this price, we'll deal with a few creaks." The drive to the rental was peaceful. They had left behind the noise of the city, eagerly anticipating a quiet, romantic getaway. As they drove down the winding, empty roads leading to the house, the landscape turned dark and dense with towering trees. Shadows seemed to stretch across the road, but Ben kept the mood light, cracking jokes and brushing off Sarah's growing unease. By the time they arrived, night had fully set in, casting an eerie silence over the house. The air was cold, sharper than they'd expected for autumn, but the lights in the house flickered on as they unlocked the door, casting a soft glow that seemed to dispel their doubts. Inside, the house was rustic and full of character. Old paintings of stormy seas hung on the walls, thick velvet curtains framed the windows, and antique furniture filled each room. It was charming, if a bit outdated, and Sarah felt her anxiety ease as she admired the quaint kitchen with its old copper pots hanging above the stove. They settled in, unpacked, and made a small dinner, content to enjoy their little getaway. The first night was quiet, except for a few creaks here and there. Ben laughed them off as old house noises, and Sarah, trying to shake off the unease, laughed with him. But things changed on the second night. It started with small, barely noticeable things. When Sarah went to take a shower that evening, she found that her shampoo and soap had moved. She could have sworn she'd left them on the right side of the shower, but now they were on the left. She shrugged it off, blaming her forgetfulness, but a strange sensation prickled at the back of her mind. Later, as she and Ben were preparing for bed, she noticed that her jewelry box was open. She always closed it after taking off her necklace and rings, and yet there it was, wide open on the dresser. "Ben, did you mess with my jewelry box?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. He looked at her with confusion and shook his head. "No, why would I?" They exchanged a glance, but neither wanted to admit their growing discomfort. They laughed it off, though the laugh felt forced, and settled into bed, determined to enjoy their trip. That night, they were jolted awake by a loud thumping noise coming from the attic. The sound echoed through the house, heavy and rhythmic, like footsteps pacing back and forth. Sarah gripped Ben's arm, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ben nodded, trying to mask his own fear. "Probably an animal up there," he muttered, though his voice lacked confidence. The thumping continued, relentless and deliberate, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. They lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, afraid to move. The silence that followed was so thick it felt suffocating, pressing down on them, as if the very air in the room had turned heavy. Ben was the first to move, cautiously getting out of bed and grabbing a flashlight. "I'll check it out," he said, more to convince himself than Sarah. She watched him disappear down the hallway, her stomach churning with dread. Minutes later he returned, his face pale. "There's nothing there," he stammered, shaking his head. But something in his eyes told Sarah he wasn't being entirely truthful. They climbed back into bed, too afraid to talk about what was happening, both praying for daylight. The following morning, things seemed almost normal again. The sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow that made the house feel safe. They went about their day as if nothing unusual had happened, forcing themselves to act cheerful. But as the day wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Whenever she glanced over her shoulder, she thought she saw a shadow shifting, lingering in doorways, or darting out of sight just as she turned. By nightfall, the sense of unease had grown unbearable. They decided to head to bed early, hoping to sleep through whatever bizarre events the night might bring. But as they lay in the dark, the house seemed to come alive. They heard whispers, faint, unintelligible voices that seemed to drift through the walls. Sarah clutched Ben's hand tightly, her body tense as she strained to make out the words. But they were just out of reach, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Then the temperature in the room dropped, chilling them to the bone. They could see their breath in the air, white clouds billowing in the darkness. And that's when they heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from the closet across the room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she squeezed Ben's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, until finally, the closet door creaked open ever so slightly. A faint shadow appeared in the crack of the door, something low to the ground just out of sight. They watched, frozen with terror, as the shadow moved slowly, creeping toward the edge of the door. Ben, gathering every ounce of courage he had, grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it at the closet. But as soon as the light hit the door, the shadow vanished, leaving nothing but silence and the lingering chill in the air. By now they were both trembling, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with fear. Ben nodded, grabbing their bags without a word. They didn't bother packing properly. They simply threw everything into their suitcases, desperate to escape. As they hurried down the stairs, they heard footsteps behind them, heavy and slow, echoing through the empty house. Just as they reached the door, Sarah felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. She gasped, turning around, but there was nothing there. They burst out of the house, slamming the door behind them, and didn't look back as they sped down the dark, winding road. They drove in silence, too shaken to speak. Only when they reached the safety of a brightly lit gas station miles away did they finally pull over. As they caught their breath, Ben pulled out his phone to look up the rental listing. Curiosity and fear gnawed at him, driving him to read the reviews again. This time, he noticed details he hadn't before. People reported seeing shadows, hearing whispers, and feeling an icy presence in the house. One review even mentioned a closet that should never be opened. They'd ignored these warnings, dismissing them as exaggerations, but now they knew the truth. The house by the lake was no ordinary rental. Something dark and malevolent lived there, something that fed on fear and trapped those who ventured inside. They had narrowly escaped, but the memory of that night haunted them for years, a chilling reminder of the danger they had ignored in search of a cheap getaway. Ben and Sarah never rented an isolated house again. And as for that particular listing, the last time they checked, it was still up, the warnings buried in the reviews, waiting for the next unsuspecting couple to stumble upon it. It was supposed to be a routine drive. Emily had taken this route hundreds of times, winding down the quiet country roads that led to her small town. The sky was a watercolor of purples and oranges as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a peaceful glow over the fields stretching on either side. She had just left her best friend Jess's house after a long evening of laughs, catching up, and promises to hang out again soon. As she turned onto the final stretch of road, she reached over to plug in her phone for directions, even though she knew the way by heart. Her phone buzzed as she set it into the cradle, a new message from Jess lighting up the screen. "You left your favorite sweater here. Guess you'll just have to come back tomorrow." Emily smiled, her fingers itching to reply with a funny comeback. She knew better than to text while driving, but it was one quick reply, and the road was deserted this time of night. She glanced at her phone, her thumb hovering over the keyboard, rationalizing it to herself. Just one text, it'll only take a second. The road ahead stretched out, dark and empty, and she barely noticed the way it dipped and curved as she typed out her response. Her eyes flickered back and forth between the road and her screen, the familiarity of the route giving her a false sense of control. She'd only been distracted for a second, maybe two, but in that instant the world around her changed. In the distance, headlights emerged, faint and growing rapidly closer. Emily glanced up, her heart jolting as she realized that her car had drifted over the center line. Panic surged through her, and she jerked the wheel to correct her path. Her tires screeched as they bit into the road, sending her car into a fishtail. Her mind raced, heart pounding as she tried to regain control, but the car was no longer hers to command. The vehicle spun, tires skidding against the asphalt, and in those terrifying seconds, the only thought in her mind was "this can't be happening." She caught a glimpse of the oncoming car, a dark sedan, headlights blazing, and the horrified expression of its driver as he tried desperately to swerve out of her way. But it was too late. The last thing she saw was the flash of the sedan's grille coming toward her, followed by the shattering impact as their cars collided. The scene turned into chaos. Crumpled metal, broken glass, and the thick smell of burning rubber filled the air. Emily's head struck the steering wheel, her vision going black, as her car spun one last time before coming to a violent stop against a guardrail. Silence settled over the road, broken only by the distant hum of insects in the fields. Emily's consciousness drifted, caught between waking and darkness. She felt pain, dull and heavy, throbbing in every part of her body. Her mind struggled to piece together what had happened. She opened her eyes, blinking through the haze, her vision blurred and doubled. The airbag had deployed, its fabric stained with blood, and her phone lay on the passenger seat, screen still lit with the unfinished text message. Reality hit her like a wave, and she forced herself to look at the other car. It had veered off the road, its front crumpled against a tree. The driver's door was open, and she could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel. She tried to scream, to call for help, but her voice was a raspy whisper swallowed by the night. As minutes passed, she heard the faint sound of sirens approaching, their wails cutting through the stillness. The emergency lights flashed, casting the road in an eerie red glow. Paramedics rushed to the scene, and Emily could feel herself slipping in and out of consciousness as they worked to free her from the wreckage. She heard snippets of their voices, the urgency in their tones as they assessed the situation. "She's stable, but barely. We need to get her to the hospital now." But as they loaded her onto the stretcher, she caught sight of the other driver again. The paramedics had draped a sheet over his body, covering his face. In that instant, the full weight of her actions crashed down on her. One text, one glance away from the road, had taken a life. She wanted to scream, to apologize, to beg them to undo what had happened. But all she could do was lie there, broken and silent. Days blurred together in the hospital. She drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by flashes of the crash, of the man's face in those final moments. His haunted eyes seemed to follow her, reminding her of the irreversible mistake she had made. She learned later that his name was David. He was 45, a father of 3 on his way home from a late shift. The guilt weighed on her, suffocating her, as she imagined his family's grief and the empty space she had left in their lives. Months passed, but Emily couldn't escape the memory of that night. She couldn't shake the feeling that David's presence lingered around her, a silent reminder of her choices. At night, she'd wake up to the sound of crunching metal, the phantom sensation of headlights blinding her, or the ghostly whisper of "why" in the quiet darkness of her room. It was as if David was there watching her, unwilling to leave her in peace. Her friends and family noticed the change in her. Her once bright smile, now shadowed by a haunted look, her laughter replaced by a distant silence. She avoided the road where the accident had happened, terrified of reliving those few seconds of horror. Therapy helped, but only so much. She began to withdraw, isolating herself, consumed by guilt and haunted by the life she'd taken. One evening, as she sat in her room, staring blankly at the wall, her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and saw an unread message notification from an unknown number. Heart pounding, she opened it, her eyes scanning the screen in disbelief. "Why didn't you look up?" Her phone slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud. She froze, her mind racing. It was impossible. No one knew about that specific moment except her. She deleted the message, convinced it was her mind playing tricks on her. But the messages kept coming, each one more chilling than the last. "I trusted you to be careful, and you never even saw me." Nights became a waking nightmare. Every time she tried to sleep, she'd hear the faint sound of tires screeching, feel the sickening jolt of impact, and see David's face in the dark corners of her room, his eyes accusing, his presence inescapable. Her dreams turned into scenes of twisted metal, flashing lights, and a voice whispering in the darkness, "You took my life." Desperate for relief, she returned to the crash site, hoping that somehow facing it would help her find peace. She stood by the roadside, staring at the skid marks and shattered glass still embedded in the gravel. The wind whispered through the trees, and she swore she could hear his voice, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. "You should have looked up." Tears blurred her vision as she dropped to her knees, clutching her phone to her chest, overwhelmed by grief and guilt. She whispered a choked apology to the empty road, begging for forgiveness, hoping that somehow he'd hear her. As she stood to leave, she felt a sudden chill in the air, a coldness that wrapped around her, as if something, or someone, was finally letting go. She never received another message, but the memory remained, a constant weight she would carry for the rest of her life, a silent reminder that one careless moment could destroy everything. Emily walked away from that spot, her life forever changed. But she knew that every time she looked down at her phone, every time she thought of sending one quick message while driving, she would remember David's eyes, his unfinished journey, and the decision that cost a life on the road. Jacob loved the solitude of the mountains. After a grueling week of meetings, deadlines, and late nights, the thought of a solo hike seemed like the perfect way to unwind. He found an isolated trail online, a place few seemed to know about, promising tranquil views and dense, quiet forests. The reviews warned that it was easy to get lost, and some even mentioned mysterious, creepy sightings along the trail, but Jacob laughed them off as exaggerated tales. He had plenty of hiking experience and trusted his instincts over ominous stories. He set out early in the morning, the chill in the air refreshing as he started down the marked trail. The forest was peaceful, the sound of birds and the crunch of leaves underfoot, a welcome relief from the constant noise of the city. He was alone, and he liked it that way. Jacob was making good time, but after a few hours, he grew impatient. The map app on his phone showed a shortcut through the dense trees that would connect to the main trail further up. It seemed straightforward enough and would shave off at least a mile. Smiling at his own cleverness, he veered off the marked path, determined to save time. Within minutes, the forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing thicker, casting long shadows that blotted out the sun. The air felt colder, sharper, and the usual forest sounds had faded into an eerie silence. He brushed it off, chalking it up to nerves, and continued pushing through the underbrush. The shortcut was supposed to take no more than 15 minutes, but the minutes dragged into an hour, and the dense, unmarked forest showed no sign of letting up. He checked his phone again, hoping to get his bearings, but the map had stopped loading. Frustration turned to unease as he realized he'd lost service. Jacob stopped, taking a deep breath and trying to stay calm. The shortcut had clearly led him in the wrong direction. He took a look around, trying to remember which direction he'd come from, but every tree, every path looked the same. The faint trail he thought he'd been following had disappeared, swallowed by the forest. For the first time, he felt a sliver of fear creep in. He turned around, retracing his steps, but the forest seemed different somehow, darker, as though the trees were leaning closer, blocking out the fading light. His pulse quickened as he tried to recall any landmarks he might have passed, but everything was a blur of trees and shadows. The sun was beginning to set, casting a deep orange glow through the branches, and he knew he had to find the main trail soon, or risk being stuck out here in the dark. Then he saw something unusual, a faint, narrow path to his left. It looked worn and led deeper into the trees, but at this point it was his only option. He followed it, hoping it would lead him back to the main trail. As he walked, an eerie quiet settled over the forest. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. A chill ran down his spine when he spotted something strange up ahead. A pile of stones, stacked in an odd formation almost like a cairn, but far too small and scattered, like someone had been trying to leave a mark but had stopped midway. He moved closer, peering at it in the dimming light, and noticed scratches on the stones, deep, jagged gouges that looked like claw marks. Anxiety prickled at him, but he told himself it was just his imagination. Yet, as he backed away, he felt as though something was watching him, hidden just out of sight. He picked up his pace, his footsteps quickening as he glanced over his shoulder, feeling the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him, twisting into shapes that disappeared when he looked directly at them. He tried to shake the feeling, but it was as though the forest itself was alive, each tree, each branch, a silent witness to his growing dread. As darkness fell, he fumbled for his flashlight, the small beam cutting through the now pitch-black forest. His breath caught as the light illuminated another stack of stones, identical to the one he'd seen earlier. It was impossible. He was certain he'd been walking in the opposite direction. Panic surged through him as he realized he was moving in circles, trapped in some twisted maze. Desperation clawed at him, and he started running, branches scratching at his face and arms as he pushed blindly through the darkness. He was lost, utterly and completely, with no idea which way led to safety. The forest seemed to tighten around him, the trees bending and creaking as though mocking his every step. His flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the forest floor. Suddenly, he heard a soft rustling behind him, like something moving through the leaves. He froze, his pulse thundering in his ears as he strained to listen. It grew louder, a steady, rhythmic crunch that seemed to echo his own footsteps. He spun around, his flashlight shaking in his hand, but there was nothing there, only the dense, impenetrable darkness. Then, just as he was about to turn away, he caught a glimpse of something, a figure, pale and shadowy, standing far off between the trees. Its shape was indistinct, almost blending with the forest, but its eyes gleamed in the beam of his flashlight, 2 pinpricks of cold, unblinking light. He stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grip and landing on the ground, the beam pointing up to the trees. In that brief, terrifying moment, he saw the figure move, gliding soundlessly closer, its eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt almost hungry. Jacob's survival instincts kicked in, and he scrambled for the flashlight, his heart racing as he turned and ran, not caring where he was going. Branches clawed at him, his footsteps echoing as he sprinted through the dense forest, desperate to escape. His lungs burned, and his legs screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop, couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was following him, closing in with every step. He stumbled into a small clearing, gasping for breath, his flashlight flickering again. The trees seemed to stand taller here, looming over him, their twisted branches blocking out the stars. And there, at the edge of the clearing, stood another stone pile, this one larger, arranged in a rough circle, with something lying in the center. A tattered piece of clothing, faded and torn. His blood ran cold as he recognized it as the same color and style as his own jacket. His heart pounding as he realized he wasn't the first person to stray from the trail. The sight felt like a warning, a grim reminder of those who had come before him and never returned. A faint whispering filled the clearing, a sound so soft he could barely make it out, like voices carried on the wind, urging him to come closer, to step inside the circle. He backed away, clutching his flashlight as though it were a lifeline. His hand shook as he turned to leave, but the whispering grew louder, desperate, pleading, filling his mind until he could think of nothing else. Just as he reached the edge of the clearing, the flashlight died, plunging him into darkness. Panic seized him, and he ran blindly, his only focus on getting as far from that place as possible. He stumbled, fell, his hands scraping against rocks and roots as he pushed himself up, driven by an instinctual terror. The whispers faded, replaced by the pounding of his heart, and then, at last, he saw it, the faint, familiar line of the main trail. Relief flooded through him, and he staggered onto the path, too exhausted to care about his cuts and bruises. The forest was silent again, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifting as he stumbled down the trail. He didn't look back, didn't care to know if anything was following him, too grateful to have found his way out. By the time he reached his car, dawn was breaking, casting a pale light over the forest. He collapsed into the driver's seat, his hands still trembling as he started the engine. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and for a split second, he saw something standing at the edge of the trees, watching him with cold, unblinking eyes. Jacob never hiked alone again. He left the mountain that morning with a story he could never bring himself to share, a reminder of the terror that lurked in the wilderness, waiting for those who strayed from the safety of the path. And as he sped down the mountain road, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home, a dark presence that lingered just beyond sight, waiting patiently for him to make one wrong turn. It was supposed to be an ordinary night out, a quick drink with friends after a long work week. Ethan wasn't much of a drinker, and he prided himself on his self-control. Just one drink, he told his friends as they gathered around the bar. He would sip slowly, enjoy the conversation, and head home early, ready for a quiet weekend. But as the night wore on, his friends persuaded him to have another, and then another. By midnight, he felt a slight buzz, but nothing he couldn't handle. He'd driven home feeling worse before, he thought. One more drink couldn't hurt. Ethan waved off his friends' offers to call him a ride, insisting he was fine to drive. "I'm good, really. It's just a short drive back," he said, laughing. He climbed into his car, the world around him feeling just a little too quiet, as he left the warmth and laughter of the bar. The streets were empty, the neon signs from closed shops casting eerie glows across the road. A fine mist had settled, giving everything an unsettling, dreamlike quality. He was only 15 minutes from home, a straight shot through the outskirts of town. As he turned onto the highway, he felt his confidence waver. His vision seemed slightly blurred, and the road appeared to stretch out longer than usual, bending and twisting under the haze. He shook his head, trying to clear his mind, blaming the foggy effect on the drinks. "Just keep your eyes on the road," he whispered to himself, gripping the wheel a little tighter. But the feeling of something off hung in the air, creeping into his mind like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. Then, out of nowhere, he saw a figure on the side of the road, just on the edge of his headlight's reach. Startled, he slowed down, peering into the darkness, but the figure was gone. He chalked it up to his imagination, the alcohol playing tricks on his eyes. He tried to laugh it off, but an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. He turned up the radio, hoping the music would drown out the strange silence that seemed to close in around him. A few minutes later, his headlights caught something again, a fleeting glimpse of movement by the roadside. This time, it was a woman, standing still, her back to him, shrouded in a long, dark coat. His hands tightened on the wheel, and he felt his pulse quicken. She seemed out of place, standing there in the middle of nowhere, staring into the dark forest. He slowed down instinctively, glancing in his rearview mirror as he passed. But when he looked back, she was gone. The road behind him was empty. Ethan's heart pounded as he forced himself to drive on, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But as he drove further, a chilling realization crept into his mind. No matter how far he drove, the same dark figure seemed to appear again and again, just at the edge of his headlights. Her outline would emerge from the fog, standing by the side of the road, and then vanish as he drew near. Each time she was closer, her face turned a little more toward him, yet he could never quite make out her features. His hands began to shake, sweat forming on his brow despite the cold. He took deep breaths, but the dread grew heavier with each mile. "Get a grip, Ethan. It's just your imagination," he muttered to himself, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. But the figure kept appearing, each time drawing closer to the center of the road, until finally she was directly in his path. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as his car came to a halt. The figure stood in front of his headlights now, her face partially hidden by the fog, but he could see her eyes, dark and hollow, staring straight at him. Ethan's heart raced as he blinked, hoping she would disappear as before. But she remained, her gaze unblinking, her presence suffocating. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed down the road, her arm extending toward a bend in the distance. Ethan's throat tightened as he realized she was signaling him to follow. He wanted to turn back, to flee, but something in her gaze held him captive, as though an invisible force was urging him forward. Against every instinct, he eased off the brakes, inching the car forward, unable to tear his eyes away from her. As he approached, she stepped aside, disappearing into the fog once again. Shaken, Ethan continued driving, his mind racing. He kept his eyes glued to the road, but the further he drove, the stranger things became. The air grew thick, and an unsettling silence replaced the hum of the radio, which had gone silent. The fog seemed to thicken around him, turning the familiar road into a twisting labyrinth. Then he saw it, a wrecked car on the side of the road, half hidden in the fog. It was eerily similar to his own, the same color, the same model, crumpled and abandoned, its shattered glass glinting in his headlights. His blood ran cold as he stared at it, a sense of dread washing over him. The license plate was identical to his. He slammed on the brakes, his mind reeling. How was this possible? It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The woman's figure appeared beside the wreck, standing silently, her face hidden in shadows. She raised her hand, pointing toward the wreckage, as if urging him to come closer. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel, unable to look away from her accusing stare. Without thinking, he stepped out of the car, drawn toward the wreck as if under a spell. The silence was oppressive, the air thick and still, broken only by the crunch of his footsteps on the gravel. As he neared the wreck, he saw a figure slumped over the steering wheel, and his heart sank as he recognized the clothes, the hair. The figure was him. His mind struggled to process it, a cold sweat breaking out as he backed away, horrified. A voice whispered through the fog, soft and sorrowful, as though carried on the wind. "One more drink." Suddenly he was back in his car, the vision gone, his heart racing as he gasped for air. The road ahead was empty, and the wreck had vanished, but the sense of dread remained, heavy and lingering. His hands shook as he clutched the wheel, his pulse pounding as he forced himself to keep driving, desperate to escape whatever horror he'd glimpsed. The figure didn't appear again, but the journey seemed endless, the road stretching on, in a twisted loop. Each mile felt like an eternity, his thoughts haunted by the vision of his own lifeless body slumped over the wheel. Finally, as dawn broke, he saw the familiar turnoff for his street. He breathed a sigh of relief, his muscles aching from tension as he pulled into his driveway. He stumbled out of the car, exhausted and shaken, but alive. As he approached his front door, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his blood running cold as he read the notification. Unknown number, one more drink. His hand trembled, the text a chilling reminder of the night he'd just survived. He deleted the message, refusing to acknowledge it, yet the words stayed with him, echoing in his mind. From that night on, Ethan never touched a drink again. He lived with a sense of unease, haunted by the memory of the woman on the road and the vision of his own death. Every time he passed that stretch of highway, he could almost feel her watching him, her dark, hollow eyes, a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything for just one drink. It started as a dare. A group of friends, Mike, Jenna, Sam, and Rachel, sat around the fire pit in Mike's backyard, swapping stories and laughing under the stars. The topic drifted to local legends, and Sam brought up the old Danvers Mill on the outskirts of town. "You know that place has been abandoned for decades, right?" he said, a mischievous glint in his eye. "They say it's haunted or cursed, or both. People see lights and shadows in the windows, hear weird noises, and some don't make it out." Rachel scoffed, laughing. "It's just an old building. Those stories are just to keep kids from messing around there." But her voice held a note of doubt. Mike, always the thrill seeker, grinned. "So why don't we check it out? One night of exploring. We'll be back by morning, and we'll have a good story to tell." Sam and Jenna exchanged a nervous glance, but nodded. The excitement was infectious. It was just an abandoned mill, after all. What could really go wrong? By midnight, they were driving through the dark, empty roads that led to the outskirts of town. As they approached the site, an eerie silence settled over them. Danvers Mill loomed ahead, its outline stark against the moonlit sky. Once a thriving factory, it was now a decaying hulk. Its windows shattered, walls cracked, and the large iron gates chained shut. Yellow caution tape flapped in the wind around the perimeter, faded and frayed, like a warning that had been ignored one too many times. The friends climbed over the rusted gate, ducking under the caution tape with nervous laughs, each pretending they weren't unsettled by the foreboding silence. The air was heavy with the scent of rust and mildew. Flashlights clicked on, casting beams of light that danced over the crumbling walls and broken windows. Their footsteps echoed as they stepped into the mill's vast, empty lobby, where abandoned machinery lay scattered, covered in years of dust and grime. As they ventured deeper into the mill, the temperature seemed to drop, and an odd, suffocating stillness settled around them. Rachel shivered, hugging herself. "Does anyone else feel that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mike rolled his eyes. "It's just the wind. Old buildings are like this. Don't go all horror movie on us now." But Jenna wasn't convinced. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale. "This place feels wrong," she muttered. None of them wanted to admit it, but they all felt it. A strange, heavy presence in the air, as though the walls were holding on to secrets too dark to reveal. They pressed on, moving through narrow hallways and rooms that seemed to stretch longer than they should have, their flashlights casting eerie shadows that played tricks on their eyes. They reached the main factory floor, a vast open space filled with rows of silent, rusted machinery. The floor was covered in grime, and thick layers of dust hung in the air, disturbed only by their footsteps. Faded posters lined the walls, but the text was illegible, smeared by time and rot. Sam took a few steps forward, peering around curiously. "They say people disappeared here," he whispered, half joking. "Workers, and even a couple of explorers who thought they'd found a shortcut through town." Just as he finished speaking, they heard a soft creaking sound, like footsteps echoing in the distance. They froze, their hearts pounding as they strained to listen. "Did you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. Mike shone his flashlight in the direction of the noise, but it revealed only empty, dusty corridors. "It's probably just an animal," he said, trying to sound confident. But his face was pale, and his voice wavered. The creaking grew louder, closer, like footsteps approaching them, yet there was no one in sight. They stood in a tense circle, each feeling the weight of fear settling over them, gripping their flashlights as though they were lifelines. Then, without warning, the lights flickered, dimming until they were left in near darkness. Panic surged as they frantically smacked their flashlights, each trying to get their beam back. "This is not funny," Rachel hissed, her voice strained. Suddenly, they heard a low, groaning sound, like metal scraping against metal, echoing through the cavernous room. The air grew colder, and an overpowering stench of rot and decay filled the space. Jenna gagged, covering her nose. "What is that smell?" she choked out, her eyes wide with horror. Then, as their flashlights finally flickered back on, they saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the factory floor, shrouded in shadows. It was barely visible, but they could make out its outline. A tall, gaunt figure, standing unnaturally still. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were empty sockets, dark and hollow, watching them with an intensity that made their blood run cold. The figure didn't move, but its presence was palpable, filling the room with a sinister energy that seemed to crawl under their skin. Sam stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. We need to get out of here," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. But as they turned to leave, they heard the figure's raspy, echoing voice, like nails scraping across metal, whispering, "Stay with us." The words echoed through the factory, each syllable resonating in their bones. The walls seemed to close in, and as they looked around, they noticed things they hadn't seen before. Dark stains on the floor that looked disturbingly like old blood, scratch marks on the walls, and tattered clothing scattered in the corners. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very building was alive, breathing around them, trapping them within its decaying walls. Panicked, they ran for the exit, their footsteps echoing through the corridors, but the layout of the building seemed to shift with every turn. Hallways stretched longer. Rooms they hadn't entered before appeared out of nowhere, and no matter where they ran, they found themselves back on the factory floor, the figure standing just a little closer each time, its hollow gaze following them with an unnatural, sinister curiosity. Rachel was the first to break down, sobbing as she stumbled to the ground, her hands covering her face. "We're never getting out," she cried, her voice a broken whisper. Mike grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "Yes, we are," he insisted, though his face betrayed his own fear. "There has to be a way out." Just then, the figure's whisper filled the room again, louder this time, reverberating in their skulls. "You're already here. You've always been here." The words twisted in their minds, filling them with a sense of despair that felt insurmountable. They felt as if they'd been in the mill for days, though it had only been minutes since they'd entered. Time seemed to distort, stretching and twisting, leaving them disoriented and exhausted. Desperation overtook them, and they split up, hoping to find an exit quicker. But as they wandered, each of them began to hear voices, whispers echoing in their ears, calling their names, speaking of regrets, of mistakes they thought they'd forgotten. Shadows flickered in their peripheral vision, growing darker and denser, until it felt like hands reaching out, grasping, pulling them deeper into the mill's darkness. Jenna stumbled upon a doorway that looked like an exit, a faint glow of moonlight spilling through the cracks. She called out to the others, hope rising in her chest, but as she reached for the door, it slammed shut, locking her inside a small, windowless room. Her flashlight flickered, and she heard a faint, rasping breath behind her. Slowly, she turned, and there, mere inches from her face, was the figure, its hollow sockets staring into her soul, a twisted smile forming on its decayed lips. Outside, Mike, Sam, and Rachel heard her scream, a sound of pure, unbridled terror that echoed through the building. They tried to find her, but the factory had become a maze, each turn leading them further from each other, from any sense of reality. One by one, they felt the cold grip of something unnatural closing in, the walls whispering their fears, their secrets, until they were overwhelmed by the oppressive darkness. When dawn broke, the friends were nowhere to be found. The authorities discovered their abandoned car outside the gates of Danvers Mill, but inside, there was no trace of them, just a series of new, disturbing scratch marks on the walls, fresh stains on the factory floor, and 4 abandoned flashlights lying in a circle on the factory floor, their batteries drained. The townspeople added their story to the growing legends of Danvers Mill. warning others to stay away. But the abandoned factory stood silent, waiting patiently for the next visitors who would ignore the caution tape and wander into the darkness, only to vanish like those before them, trapped forever by the dark secret the mill refused to let go. It was a rainy Saturday night, and a thick fog hung outside, blanketing the streets and muffling the sounds of the town. Jenna, Mike, Lisa, and Kevin were gathered in Jenna's basement, trying to decide how to pass the evening. Someone suggested watching a horror movie, but Lisa, ever the skeptic, had a bolder idea. "Let's finally put this paranormal nonsense to rest," she said, a grin spreading across her face. "Let's try a Ouija board and see what all the fuss is about." The others exchanged nervous glances, but Mike, who hated to back down from a challenge, shrugged. "Sure, why not? It'll be fun. Besides, it's just a game," he said, though he didn't miss the unease in Jenna's eyes. Kevin looked unsure, glancing around the dimly lit basement, but he didn't want to be the odd one out. "Fine," he mumbled, fidgeting with his hoodie strings. "Let's do it." Jenna reluctantly retrieved an old Ouija board from a dusty box in the attic. It had been her grandmother's, though she had no idea why her grandmother owned one. She'd always thought it was a relic from some Halloween party long ago. They arranged the board on the table, set up a few flickering candles, and sat in a circle, fingers barely touching the planchette. The atmosphere shifted as soon as they placed their hands on the board, an almost imperceptible chill creeping into the room, sending goosebumps prickling up their arms. Lisa, who had suggested the idea, took charge. She cleared her throat, trying to mask the slight tremble in her voice. "Is there anyone here who'd like to speak to us?" she called out, adopting an exaggerated, mock-serious tone. Kevin chuckled nervously, and they all exchanged glances, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The planchette remained still, and after a few moments, Jenna laughed, relief evident in her voice. "See? It's just a silly game." But just as they were about to pull their hands away, the planchette began to move, slowly, deliberately, sliding across the board in small circles. Lisa rolled her eyes, accusing Mike of pushing it, but Mike looked just as startled. "I didn't touch it, I swear," he insisted, his face pale. The laughter faded, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. "Who are we speaking to?" Jenna asked, her voice barely a whisper. The planchette moved again, spelling out each letter with chilling precision. S-A-M. "Sam?" Kevin repeated, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Who's Sam?" The board remained still, and the group relaxed slightly, thinking the spirit, if there was one, had left. But then the planchette moved again, spelling out I-W-A-S-H-E-R. Lisa's skeptical grin faltered as the planchette spelled a chilling message, "Help me." They all felt it, a subtle shift in the air, as if an invisible presence had settled around them. Jenna swallowed hard, gripping the edge of her chair. "What do you need help with?" she whispered, feeling silly but strangely compelled to ask. "Trapped." A shiver ran down each of their spines as the planchette darted from letter to letter, spelling out fragmented sentences. "They left me. I'm still here." "What do you mean, trapped?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling now, the confidence she'd felt moments earlier gone. The planchette spelled out the words with unnerving speed, faster than any of them could have moved it. "Hurt, nowhere, no light." Lisa pulled her hands away, her face pale. "This is stupid. It's obviously a prank. One of you is pushing it." "No one's pushing it, Lisa," Jenna replied, her voice barely audible. She tried to pull her hand away too, but it felt stuck to the planchette, as though something was holding her there. Then, without warning, the lights in the basement flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Jenna let out a yelp, and Mike fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight. The dim beam cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but as he moved the light around, they saw something they hadn't noticed before. A name carved faintly into the basement wall, the letters jagged and uneven. Sam. Jenna's heart pounded as she remembered a story her grandmother had once told her about the previous owners of the house, a family who had left under mysterious circumstances. The youngest child, a boy named Sam, had reportedly gone missing, never to be found. The case had remained unsolved, and her grandmother had always warned her to avoid the basement at night. But Jenna had brushed it off as an old woman's superstition. Now, though, the basement felt alive with a sinister energy, as though the very walls were whispering their secrets. They all exchanged nervous glances, panic setting in as they realized the weight of their mistake. "We need to stop," Kevin said, his voice shaky. "This isn't a game anymore." But the board seemed to disagree. The planchette began moving on its own, their hands barely touching it, as though it was desperate to communicate. "You can't leave," it spelled out, the letters sliding across the board with unsettling speed. Lisa was the first to stand up, her chair scraping against the floor as she backed away. "I'm done. This is insane," she whispered, her face pale. But the moment she moved away, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang, as though an unseen hand had forced it closed. They all jumped, their breaths coming in shallow gasps as they stared at the door, paralyzed with fear. Mike rushed to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though it had been locked from the outside. He banged on it, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. "Let us out," he yelled, panic lacing his voice. The planchette began to move again, faster this time, spelling out a single word: "Stay." Lisa's voice trembled as she muttered, This is impossible. There's no way." And then they heard it, a faint whisper drifting through the room, echoing off the walls. "Help me!" It was the voice of a young boy, pleading, desperate. The sound sent chills through each of them, and Jenna's stomach churned as she realized they weren't alone. "He's here," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and filling the room, a cacophony of voices, each more desperate than the last. The air grew colder, and the candles they'd lit began to flicker, casting ominous shadows that seemed to shift and move. Then they saw him, a faint ghostly figure standing in the corner of the room. He was young, no older than 10, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to bore into their souls. His face was pale, his clothes tattered, and he stared at them with a look of such anguish that Jenna felt her heart break. "Sam," she whispered, her voice shaking. The boy didn't move, didn't blink. His gaze was fixed on them, unblinking, as though he was searching for something, waiting for an answer they couldn't give. "Why did you call me?" his voice echoed, filling the room. "Why did you bring me back?" Lisa, who had been skeptical all along, backed into the wall, trembling, her bravado shattered. "We're sorry," she stammered, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't know. We thought it was just a game." But the boy's expression turned cold, his face twisted in anger. "You called me, and now you will stay." Before they could react, the room went pitch black. Jenna felt a sharp, icy pain shoot up her arm, as though something was grabbing her, leaving a searing mark on her skin. She screamed, pulling her arm away. But when the lights flickered back on, she saw the mark. A deep red handprint burned into her wrist, as though branded by an unseen force. The boy was gone, but his presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. They scrambled for the door, banging and clawing until it finally swung open. They rushed out, hearts pounding, stumbling up the stairs and into the safety of the living room, where they collapsed, gasping for breath. For weeks after, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The mark on her wrist didn't fade, and she often woke in the middle of the night, hearing whispers and feeling a cold presence beside her bed. The others experienced strange occurrences too, doors slamming, objects moving on their own, shadows lurking in the corners of their rooms. Jenna's life became consumed by the boy's spirit, haunted by the mistake they'd made, marked forever by their deadly experiment with the paranormal. They had brought something back from the other side, and now it refused to let them go. The Ouija board had closed that night, but Sam had never left. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.